It's hard to know exactly when humans began engaging in the behavior which we refer to today as religion. This is partially because such evidence may not have been preserved for so long, but it's also because it's not always easy to define what precisely constitutes religious behavior. But it's pretty clear that as humans became more intelligent, more organized, and more civilized, the degree of their religiosity expanded greatly. And they began to devote a significant amount of their time and energy towards religion. The evidence for which is staggering. Now, I've already said that religion is hard to define, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to focus on one particularly prominent and universal aspect of religion, which is the belief in supernatural entities called gods. Beings which appear to have no tangible existence in the physical world. And it's hard to fully convey just how obsessed we used to be with such entities. There was a time when religion was a central aspect in the life of every individual. And even things like farming or war were thoroughly imbued with religious connotations. An immense amount of human effort was directed towards the building of statuary and temples dedicated to the gods. There were hundreds of rituals, festivals, and public events through which people could express their devotion, as well as thousands of mythological stories in which the gods were active participants. And it wasn't merely that we believed in the gods or that we worshipped the gods had a functional role within the fabric of society. If we examine the earliest city-states of Mesopotamia, the gods were actually considered to be the true rulers of each city. And so the main temples were also the seats of government. The gods were believed to animate statues which resided within the sacred temples. Priests were the servants or emissaries of the gods, and it was their job to communicate with the gods, understand their commands, and then ensure that the populace obeyed their commands. This means that governance and administration were themselves religious affairs. There was no separation of church and state, or in this case, temple and state, because they were the same thing. And so religion wasn't just this minor thing which people participated in on weekends or holidays. It was crucial for their ability to partake in collective society, and so religion featured prominently within the life of every individual. The gods also played a significant role in early mythologies, with characters often having casual conversations with such beings, as though conversing with an all-powerful entity was a normal and typical occurrence. Gods were believed to be responsible for the origins of existence and all natural phenomena, and thousands of such beings were worshipped throughout history. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was considered to be the chief priest of the gods and was himself considered to be a living god incarnated upon the earth before ascending to live with the other gods upon his death. And the amount of architecture and art made in reverence to the gods of Egypt is truly staggering. And it really demonstrates just how religious we used to be in the past and how central the gods were in every person's life. And it's important to remember that ancient Egypt lasted more than 3,000 years. And while dynasties changed, the gods and their religious practices mostly stayed intact. And I think that this demonstrates that there must have been something useful about religion in an evolutionary sense. Because clearly there's a connection between how religious people were in ancient Egypt and how successful ancient Egypt was. So religion was clearly an important factor in the growing cultural sophistication of the human species. And the gods were a prominent and necessary feature for organizing societies. Religion itself must have been instrumental for human civilization in the past, because it would have allowed people to cooperate on a larger scale. And as a unified whole, it allowed them to do things like build cities and towns which could accommodate thousands of individuals. Something which is unprecedented among social primates who usually live in troops of less than 40 individuals. Without religion, the social cohesion needed for this level of societal harmony would have evaporated. And so religion provided a mechanism of social control, or social obedience if you prefer to think of it that way. Gods were a widespread phenomenon across the ancient world. And they represent a massive shift in human behavior and psychology from the time when we lived in small hunter-gatherer bands. And we're not significantly different from our primate relatives. So the question we want to ask is, what is going on here? What exactly are these entities called gods, and why were humans so obsessed with them in the past? And why aren't we as devoted to such beings today? The first possibility is that for some reason in the past, such entities objectively existed. They really interacted with human beings, allowing them to become more civilized, but then at some point they decided to abandon humanity. And now, when we worship such supernatural entities, we have faith that they exist, even though they don't seem to make their presence as deliberately and unambiguously known. Suffice it to say, this isn't very satisfying, but hold on to this idea. Another possibility, one which may be popular amongst those of you who have cynical views of religion, is that a high class of priests invented the idea of gods in order to manipulate people. It would go something like this. I, the High Priest of Inanna, Lord of the city of Uruk, declare that Inanna wishes that all citizens pay me 5% of their income.
Oh, come on!
Hey, don't blame me, that's just what Inanna said. Now, I don't want to suggest that corruption doesn't occur in religion. It most definitely does, as it does in any system which involves the relegation of power. But I believe that this is far too simplistic to account for a very widespread phenomenon which definitely occurred in the past. First of all, if this really was just a high class of priests manipulating people for their own benefit, it's hard to see how a system like this could be so successful for so long. Remember, some of these early city-states lasted for thousands of years. And it's hard to imagine a system built entirely upon corruption being so successful. Because there has to be some benefit to this. There has to be something advantageous for survival, which religion was providing, and that would explain the impetus people had to continually worship the gods and depend upon them. And I find it hard to believe that the people of these magnificent civilizations were so steadfastly enamored with the gods just because a high class of priests had successfully fooled thousands of people. It's also harder to imagine that this exact same thing repeated itself all across the ancient world. From Japan to China to India to Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even the Americas. For tens of thousands of years, all while the devotion and reverence people held for the gods is very apparent from the historical evidence. And so I'm arguing that for people to be this religious for so long would have required some impetus to believe in the gods apart from trusting some guy. And here we come to what is, in my opinion, the best explanation. An explanation from the psychological perspective. This idea is that the gods weren't physically present and tangible, but instead were a psychological phenomenon, appearing within the minds of people through hallucinations. People back then may have believed these hallucinations because they wouldn't have been familiar with the idea of hallucinations, and so the hallucinations that appeared before them could be convincingly real. Think about it. If you were a person living back then with your limited knowledge of the human brain and a divine entity appeared before you, wouldn't you believe that it was real as well? And so I'm arguing that these divine entities were really a collective psychological phenomenon being projected outwards. When priests communicated with the statues of gods, they may have hallucinated the statue speaking back to them. This is for me the most convincing explanation for why people seem to be totally convinced about the existence of such beings. Because from their perspectives, such beings were unambiguously real. And this is why we have thousands of stories involving the gods appearing before people. The gods must have been experienced through hallucinations, which back then people would have taken to be real. The reason people believed in gods is because their experience of the world presented them with this irrefutable fact. There was no reason to have faith in God because God was an ever-present reality. It would be like having faith in the existence of the sun. Do you need faith to believe in the sun? The idea of having faith in one's religion is actually a relatively new idea, one which was spawned in an era where we no longer seem to hallucinate the presence of such beings. This idea is captured by the theory of the bicameral mind, a very multi-layered and deep theory which postulates that mankind's early religious experiences were fundamentally hallucinatory in nature. But these hallucinations weren't just random and chaotic, but actually useful. By which I mean they could provide useful information, and they allowed civilizations to form because every individual would be subordinate to these higher divine beings whose presence they could feel at all times. In fact, this theory posits that before we listened to our own internal monologue and used our egos to make decisions, these hallucinations took on the role of human volition or human agency. The voices of the gods told us what to do, and we obeyed their commands. The idea of hallucinations being useful shouldn't be that surprising because your own inner monologue is itself a kind of hallucination being produced by your brain using language. But this theory explains why almost all early mythologies involve people having conversations with divine entities, because such conversations must have been a normal occurrence. These gods are often portrayed as obvious facts about the universe. The characters often just accept that they can communicate with the gods. And so it is quite likely that in the early psychological development of modern humans, we could produce hallucinations and communicate with these hallucinations as though we were speaking with an autonomous entity. In reality, these hallucinations would have been coming from within a person's own mind, but they didn't know that. From their perspective, these higher beings were speaking directly to them. So if you think about it, speaking with a god would have been a way to access a different part of your mind, or a different personality within your psyche. And this is where the word bicameral in the bicameral mind come from. It refers to the fact that human nature may have been split between these two kind of different personalities, a man and a god. And while they're compartmentalized from each other, they constitute the same entity. And there's good evidence to suggest that these hallucinations would have been experienced as auditory hallucinations, as voices which sound just like real voices. This is in contrast to your own inner monologue, which you usually think of as coming from yourself, rather than believing that it's like someone else speaking to you. Although that is an interesting thought to consider, like what if your internal monologue was actually somebody else speaking to you and you just thought it was you? But regardless, early humans may have also experienced a voice coming from within their own minds. But because these voices sounded real and they sounded like somebody else speaking, they may have believed that these voices were coming from divine entities. And we know for a fact that people can experience such voices, even today. Many people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia regularly experience auditory hallucinations, which for them are indistinguishable from real voices. These voices, which are experienced by sufferers of schizophrenia, often speak nonsense, but there are many reports of voices actually conveying useful information to the person. For example, a woman who I met recently explained that she heard a voice telling her to move her parked car, and she obeyed the voice, and a few minutes later a large tree branch fell in the spot where her car was previously parked. The way I explain this is that her unconscious mind noticed something which her conscious mind didn't realize, and so her unconscious mind decided to tell her in the form of a hallucination. But you can see from such accounts why a person might believe that the voice of God is actually speaking to them, especially if they're able to give information to the person which their conscious mind is unaware of. So in my opinion, this is the most convincing explanation for the origin of religion. It explains why religion was useful, the psychological impact it would have had on people, why there was so much emphasis placed upon the gods and communicating with the gods, and why we were so reverential towards such beings for so much of human history. Because an objective glance at the historical record reveals that religion was a far more significant part of our lives than it is today. Reductive explanations which treat religion as something that's fundamentally pointless can't account for the fact that people who were religious in the past were able to form these huge civilizations which lasted for so long and eventually gave rise to us modern humans. Clearly, religion itself must have been useful in some way, and that usefulness eventually translated into us existing at our current level of psychological development. I often say that the first species on this planet to believe in the gods is also the first species to become godlike in their powers. Assuming that our ancestors were just naive and stupid for believing in the gods is, in my opinion, a very poor assessment of the abundant historical evidence which shows that at one time in human history, the gods must have been a much more tangible experience for people. And gods appearing through hallucinations is probably the best way to explain what these entities were and how they influenced the trajectory of the human species. If you want to learn more about the bicameral mind, I recommend reading the original book. It's really good and really well written. But if you're not much of a reader, you can also check out some of the videos that I have on my channel, which go into the theory in more detail. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.